The 2026 Guideline for the Early Management of Patients with Acute Ischemic Stroke, a guideline from the American Heart Association and American Stroke Association. Let's start with the basics. Section 1, airway, oxygen, and positioning.
Let's do it.
Okay, scenario 1, patient comes in, suspected stroke.
Yeah.
Do I just, put them on routine oxygen supplementation? Is that for everyone?
No. The guideline is pretty explicit on this.
Okay.
You need to maintain oxygen saturation above 94%. If the patient is hypoxic, then yes, absolutely, give them oxygen.
But if they're not?
But if they're not hypoxic, supplemental oxygen provides, well, no benefit.
So if they're sitting at, say, 96% on room air, I just leave them alone?
You leave them alone, correct. Routine supplementation in non-hypoxic patients, it just doesn't improve outcomes. There's even a theoretical risk that hyperoxia can, generate free radicals.
Right.
So we treat the number. We don't treat the anxiety of the provider.
Got it. Now, I have heard some talk about normobaric hyperoxia, those high-flow oxygen masks for specific patients. Is there anything to that?
There is. This is a specific update. It's a Class 2B recommendation, normobaric hyperoxia. It may be reasonable, but the context is everything.
Okay, what's the context?
It's specifically for patients with an anterior circulation large vessel occlusion who are candidates for endovascular thrombectomy.
Ah, so you're bridging them to the catheterization lab.
Exactly that. Using it before thrombectomy might improve functional outcomes. It's a bridge to reperfusion. But, again, that is a very specific subset of patients.
And what about hyperbaric oxygen? Putting the patient in a chamber.
No benefit. It's a Class 3 recommendation, which means do not do it.
So never.
The only, and I mean only, exception is if the stroke is caused by an arterial air embolism.
Clear enough. Okay, let's talk positioning. Head of the bed, flat, elevated. What's the rule?
The rule is flexibility. We used to really obsess over this, but the data shows that comparing 0 degree or flat to 30-degree positioning shows no benefit.
Really? No benefit either way?
Not in terms of functional outcomes, no.
What about for a patient with, say, large artery atherosclerosis? I remember hearing that laying them flat helps flow.
They looked at that specifically. And even for those patients not getting reperfusion, using Trendelenburg positioning, that's, negative 20 degrees, provides no benefit.
So just position for comfort.
Position for comfort and for airway protection. You don't need to keep them flat for the sake of the vessel.
Okay, moving on to Section 2. This is the big one. Blood pressure management. I need the numbers.
Right. This depends completely on the patient type, so let's break them down.
First up, hypotension.
Correct it immediately. You have to support systemic perfusion. You have to support organ function. Hypovolemia and hypotension are the enemies of the penumbra.
You need that pressure.
You need that perfusion pressure to push blood through the collaterals.
Okay, next group. The patient is not a candidate for reperfusion. No intravenous thrombolysis, no thrombectomy, and their blood pressure is high.
If they don't have some other compelling reason, like acute heart failure or aortic dissection, you don't touch it.
You don't touch it. How high are we talking?
Unless it's greater than 20/120 millimeters of mercury.
Wow.
And that's for the first 48 to 72 hours. Initiating treatment for hypertension below that provides no benefit.
So you really just let them ride that high?
Yes. That pressure is compensatory. The body is trying to perfuse that ischemic brain. If you lower it, you might infarct the penumbra.
Okay, group 3. These are our reperfusion candidates. We want to give intravenous thrombolysis or send them for a thrombectomy.
Strict limits here, very strict. Before you start treatment, you have to lower that blood pressure to less than 185/110 millimeters of mercury.
And after treatment is done.
You have to maintain it at less than 180/105 millimeters of mercury. Got to keep it there to reduce the risk of hemorrhagic transformation.
So here's a controversy I see in the intensive care unit all the time. The patient had a successful thrombectomy. The vessel's wide open. Do we clamp down on the blood pressure then? Get it back to normal?
This is a huge warning in the 2026 guideline.
Okay.
Do not overcorrect. Intensively lowering systolic blood pressure to less than 140 millimeters of mercury after a successful thrombectomy is classified as harmful. That's a Class 3.
Harmful? Why? The pipe is open?
Because you are compromising the collateral flow to that tissue you just salvaged. The autoregulation is still impaired. That whole vascular bed is stunned.
You're starving it.
You're starving the tissue that was just saved. If you drop the pressure below 140 systolic right away, you risk extending that infarct.
That's a major takeaway. Okay, let's go to Section 3. Temperature and glucose.
Simple rules here, really. We just need to avoid the extremes.
Temperature. Are we cooling patients?
You should treat hyperthermia. So if the temperature is greater than 37.5 degrees Celsius, you treat it. Find the source of infection. Hyperthermia just accelerates ischemic injury.
But what about induced hypothermia? Cooling a normal temperature patient to protect the brain.
No benefit. Don't do it. We've seen it tried in cardiac arrest, but for awake stroke patients, induced hypothermia for neuroprotection, it just hasn't shown any benefit.
Glucose. What are my targets?
First, treat hypoglycemia immediately. That means anything less than 60 milligrams per deciliter. Hypoglycemia can mimic a stroke, and it kills neurons.
And on the high side, hyperglycemia.
You want to treat persistent hyperglycemia to get their levels somewhere between 140 and 180 milligrams per deciliter.
That seems like a pretty generous range. Why not tighter? Why not, an insulin drip to get them down to 80 to 130?
Because it provides no benefit, and it's actually dangerous.
Yeah.
Intensive control targeting that 80 to 130 range, it significantly increases the risk of severe hypoglycemia. The guidelines are pretty clear. The risk of overshoot just outweighs any potential benefit.
Got it. All right, Section 4. We're moving the patient out of the emergency department. Where do they go?
They go to a dedicated stroke unit.
And is that just a suggestion, or?
It's a Class 1 recommendation. Treatment in an organized inpatient stroke unit with that whole interdisciplinary team, it reduces mortality and it reduces disability.
For everyone.
For everyone. Regardless of age, sex, or stroke severity, it is the single most effective general intervention we have.
It's not just the bed, it's the whole system. The nursing, the protocol.
Exactly. The system of care.
Okay, so they're in the unit. Now we have to worry about clots. Deep vein thrombosis prophylaxis. What's the standard?
The Class 1 recommendation is intermittent pneumatic compression, IPCs.
What about heparin? Can we use that?
Prophylactic subcutaneous heparin is reasonable. That's a Class 2A. But the IPCs are the primary recommendation.
And what about those white elastic compression stockings? The TED hose?
Take them off. Throw them away.
That's pretty strong.
The guideline classifies elastic compression stockings as harmful. Class 3. They cause skin breakdown, ulceration, tissue necrosis, and they don't provide benefit.
Okay, do not use them. Section 5, dysphagia, nutrition, and mobilization. This is all about recovery.
Right, and there are some interesting updates here, especially on stimulation and timing.
Let's start with dysphagia. It's a huge problem. Is there anything new besides speech therapy?
Yes, actually. There's a Class 2, a recommendation for pharyngeal electrical stimulation.
Electrical stimulation.
That's right. In patients with dysphagia, it can actually reduce the severity and decrease the risk of aspiration. It can even help get them off a ventilator faster.
That's a pretty significant tool. But first things first, we have to screen before we feed.
Mandatory. Bedside swallow screen before any oral intake. You have to prevent aspiration pneumonia.
If they fail that screen, we need to feed them. So nasogastric tube or a percutaneous gastrostomy tube.
The timing is key here. You need to start an enteral diet within 7 days. And initially, nasogastric tubes are preferred.
Why not just go straight for the percutaneous gastrostomy? Seems more permanent.
Because putting one in early, we're talking the first 2 to 3 weeks, it offers no benefit compared to just managing with a nasogastric tube.
You want to give them time?
You want to give the patient time to potentially recover their swallow function before you commit them to a PEG.
Speaking of recovery, let's talk about moving. Mobilization. I feel like years ago, the big push was get them up immediately.
It was, and the pendulum has swung back hard on that. The guideline now warns against high-dose, very early mobilization.
Define very early.
Within 24 hours of the strobe onset.
So getting a patient up and walking aggressively in that first day is bad.
It's a Class 3 harm. It is associated with less favorable outcomes at 3 months compared to standard care.
Why is that? Is it about blood pressure?
Most likely, yes. The brain is an autoregulatory failure. You stand them up, the pressure drops. In a healthy brain, it compensates. In a stroke brain, that drop can reduce perfusion to the penumbra. You make things worse.
That feels really counterintuitive.
It is, but rest is physiologically necessary in that acute phase. Don't push high-intensity movement on day 1.
Section 6, medications and infection control. Let's knock out a few common practices.
Let's do it.
Prophylactic antibiotics, just in case they aspirate.
No benefit. Don't use them routinely. You treat an infection when it's diagnosed, not before.
Urinary catheters. Foley catheters for strict ins and outs.
Avoid them. Routine indwelling bladder catheters are a class 3 harm. The risk of urinary tract infections is just too high.
Okay, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs. I see these started a lot. Are we using them to help the brain rewire?
This is a really important distinction. SSRIs are a class 1 recommendation for diagnosed post-stroke depression. If the patient is depressed, you treat them.
But what if they're not depressed? Can we use an SSRI to improve motor recovery?
No, that is class 3. It is not recommended for improving motor recovery or function in patients who don't have depression.
So not as brain vitamins.
Not as brain vitamins. The evidence just isn't there anymore.
Okay, section 7, managing complications, swelling and seizures. This is where things get critical.
Malignant brain swelling is a life threat. It requires very rapid decision-making.
So when do we call the neurosurgeon for a decompressive craniectomy?
You have to look at the patient's age.
Okay, patient is 60 years old or younger, unilateral middle cerebral artery infarct, and they're deteriorating.
That's a class 1 recommendation. Decompressive craniectomy reduces mortality, and it improves outcomes. You do it. The evidence is strong.
Now, what if that same patient is over 60?
This changes to a class 2B. The surgery still reduces mortality, but the functional outcomes are often very poor.
So it's a discussion.
It's a very careful discussion with the family about what kind of life the patient would find acceptable. Survival is not the same as functional recovery.
While we're making that decision, what about medical management? Mannitol.
Yeah.
Hypertonic saline.
Osmotic therapy is reasonable, but really only as a bridge to surgery. It's not a standalone treatment. It buys you some time.
What about steroids?
No benefit. Can be harmful. Don't use them for cerebral edema and stroke.
Barbiturates. Hypothermia for swelling.
No benefit. No benefit. You're probably seeing a pattern here.
I am. So finally, seizures. We see a patient who's had a stroke. Do we start them on, say, Keppra, just in case?
No. Prophylactic anti-seizure medication provides no benefit and is not recommended.
But if they actually have a seizure?
If they have an unprovoked seizure, then you treat it to prevent another one. But you do not treat prophylactically.
So this has been a really rapid review of the do's and don'ts.
It's dense, but it's vital.
When I look at this list, no prophylactic antibiotics, no routine oxygen, no intensive glucose control, no compression stockings, no aggressive early mobilization. It really feels like we're doing less.
I think we're doing less harm. That's the shift. The whole more is better approach to these physiological parameters, it's been debunked.
Right.
We're looking for strict adherence to the parameters that actually matter, avoiding hypotension, managing a fever, and avoiding interventions that just add risk with no benefit.
So stick to the physiological bounds, but step back from these aggressive, just-in-case measures that don't work.
Exactly. Focus on the stroke unit. Focus on the airway. Focus on the blood pressure that's appropriate for their reperfusion status.
Before we go, I want to lead our listeners with one last thought. We've talked a lot about numbers and survival, but there's a class 2, a recommendation we didn't spend much time on, palliative care.
It's a critical addition to the guideline. It says that referral to palliative care resources is reasonable.
We get so caught up in the 185 over 110 and the 94% saturation. But how often do we miss that palliative care step in the rush? The guideline explicitly says we need to align our interventions with the patient's own preferences and goals.
Right. And sometimes the best care is recognizing when chasing those numbers no longer serves the patient's goals. We treat the patient, not the monitor.
And that's our analysis for today, based on the 2026 guideline for the early management of patients with acute ischemic stroke. Go review your protocols. We'll see you next time.